from some youth that on our social media channels that knew this was happening. So those are going to be questions that we answer in a fishbowl conversation. So what I mean by that is every single panelist is going to have a couple of minutes to answer the question that was asked. So you're going to get answers from various perspectives. And I think that makes it a richer dialogue. And then after that fishbowl conversation, we're going to move on to the questions in the chat, and then we'll close out. And if we don't have time for all of that, like I said, have no fear. We will make sure you get some of those answers. Very quickly, I would like everybody to introduce themselves. I'm going to start out with our two youth, the two KCI youth, Pooja and Sophie, that are joining us today, but I'm going to let them tell you a little bit about themselves. If we can start with Sophie.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophie Farrick and I am a Kennebunk High School student. I am also a KCI Youth Ambassador and I am in the Gulf of Maine Field Studies class taught by Miss Lucci along with UNE professors. And climate change is important to me because my family has lived on the coast for quite some time, especially my grandparents. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pooja Tulhawala, and I'm KCI's first climate career winner, helping to educate, empower, and activate youth in the climate space. Climate change is important to me because it is extremely unjust that those polluting the most have such an influence on the environment of those polluting the least, yet those most vulnerable often do not have opportunities to influence key policy decisions to protect their environment.
Thank you guys for introducing yourselves. So I'm going to take a second and let David introduce himself, and then Kate. They're going to tell you a little bit about their organizations as well as their positions both on the transition team and then the Maine Climate Council as well.
Great, thanks Leah, and good afternoon folks. Really grateful to be here and grateful for KCI for organizing this and a pleasure to sit alongside Pooja and Sophie and Kate on this panel. I came to Southern Maine back in August, so just about 6 months ago after a decade of federal service. Worked on various climate science policy positions at the State Department and at the White House, including leading the fourth National Climate Assessment. But what really drew me to the Gulf of Maine Research Institute was the way they approached their work. You know, we are founded on a bedrock of rigorous fundamental scientific research, primarily in the marine domain, but we have really strong education and community programs as well, with the education team reaching out to pretty much every middle schooler across the state to ensure they understand what the Gulf of Maine means to the region and how it's changing and what the implications are for those changes for our economy and for our livelihoods. Our community team really, I think in many ways, sets us apart from a lot of other traditional sort of research institutes in that we really do strong, not just user engaged and user inspired, but user driven research that not only informs the way we do our work, but also ensuring that what we do is responsive to their needs. And so we have a really strong program in seafood supply chain, in aquaculture business planning, in coastal community adaptation, and a variety of other kind of technical and capacity building endeavors with marine and coastal stakeholders. Over the past several years, GMRI recognized that so much of their work has climate themes running through it. And so they realized that it would be beneficial, not just for the organization, but for the region as a whole, to launch a new climate center to really pull those themes together, to kind of raise the visibility of that work, to bring it to new audiences such as you all, but also to kind of chart out new territory to make sure that, you know, the stakeholders in the region have the tools and the knowledge they need to not only prepare for, but also to respond to the changes that are not just coming, but are here today. I was also fortunate to, over the past couple of months, serve on the Biden-Harris presidential transition team. And so obviously that work started a little bit before the election in early November. and we can talk a little bit about the transition if you want, how it was structured, but I served on the what's called the agency review team for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And my role there was really kind of threefold. The first was to kind of understand what the lay of the land was within the agency, within the office, and what they had done over the past 4 years. And it was also to kind of start to lay the plan for the incoming team to hit the ground running on day one and to be able to implement the Biden-Harris climate priorities as efficiently as possible. And the third piece was to make sure that we did extensive external engagement with partner organizations and stakeholders that typically engage with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to understand what their needs are, to hear some of their, frankly, some of their frustrations over the past 4 years, but also what some of the opportunities and needs that they see OSTP, as that office is called, ought to be doing in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks to all of you for joining us on what, at least here in Bath, Maine, where I sit, and right down from Morris High School for high school students, if you know that part of town. I work with the Nature Conservancy. I'm our state director here in Maine, and we are a really interesting organization because we work all over the world. We have place-based action on the ground in 70 countries across the planet. And our work is tied together through people like all of us, volunteers, and staff members, or about 4,000 or so of us around the world who work together. And we really have two major thrusts to our work, which is why we're all here today. The first is taking action on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. We can talk about what those two words mean if that helps. And also, you know, we're an organization that's about 68 years old. We've always cared about healthy lands and waters wherever we work. Biodiversity and extinction of species is a pressing issue as well. And of course, these subjects go hand in hand. So making sure there's space and places for all sorts of species to thrive, and that includes people in those conversations. So here in Maine, we are really focused on climate change. We do forest conservation, we do river restoration, so opening the rivers up from dam removal and other infrastructure modifications. We work very closely with fishermen as well, sometimes in partnership with GMRI. So that's, as we say in Maine, wicked fun, and a great big impact when you work with resource users. So that might be a theme that we could talk about to create action. The one thing, and let me just also say, I'm really proud to even be on this panel with KCI. I've been watching your work as Leah knows for a little while, and it's just great to be here and see all these people coming together. The team asked me to think just really quickly, talk about how the Climate Council here in Maine was formed and what happened and where we are right now. And I'll just do super high level, and if questions come in, we'll go with those. So in June 2019, Governor Janet Mills signed into law the creation of the Maine Climate Council. And we, on the Climate Council, had to put together a 4-year plan to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030, so 9 more years, and by 80% by 2050. And the governor then set an additional goal to achieve carbon neutrality as a state by 2045. I had the honor of serving on the council. There were many, many, many working groups, and many of them will continue to consider questions around the fact that most of our emissions here in Maine, or about 52%, come from the transportation industry. The council also dug into issues of building codes, resilience, as you were talking about, Sophie, living on the coast. What does that mean for communities along the coast? But surprisingly, big storms also have huge huge impact inland. So how do we build infrastructure that takes in, the needs of nature and helps us live into the next 10 years and beyond? I think the other really important piece that is a theme for this conversation is when the Climate Council started, the legislature had put in language about equity as one of the goals to achieve, kind of to your point, Pooja. And through the one-year process, and as I said, it's ongoing, there was a stronger focus on equity that really began to coalesce probably around the time of the beginning of the pandemic, and everyone seeing the, really clearly disparities in our own state and around the country and around the world. And then the other thing that was really, really heartening is the Climate Council working groups all had youth voices represented, but of course one person can't speak for all. And what I was really impressed with was those who were serving on the council connecting back to their communities and group like KCI to hear their needs. And as a result, climate education was inserted into the climate plan. It was absent before when we started. And the other really fun thing that I think we'll all have to dig into is that we recommended that the state should partner with service learning organizations and other non-governmental organizations to launch a Maine Climate Corps program by 2 years from now. So we can talk a bit more about that, but why don't I pause there and see what Megan and Leo want me to do.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. I appreciate both of you guys being on this panel and giving us some background both on the national level and on the state level of what's happening and the focuses that are kind of changing towards climate change. And I cannot wait to hear some answers to the questions that we have had asked. So I'm going to go ahead and start with some of the questions. We have about 5 that were asked previously, and I'm going to start with those. We're going to go in the same order every single time. So David, you're going to start, and then it'll go to Pooja, then Sophie, and then Kate. Kate, we're just saving the best for last. Oh, no pressure.
I don't mind being sweep.
So the first question we got was, we've known the science of climate change for many years, since the 1800s, really. So why have we not seen big changes in order to mitigate climate change? Why aren't we seeing sweeping changes in our country or around the world? So from your own perspectives, with your own thought processes and your own experience, we want to hear your response to that. So David, I'm going to let you start.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And early on in my career, I had the viewpoint that, we just need to give people more information. They don't understand the problem. And if they understood the problem, then, surely they will act, right? I think it's abundantly clear that we are not dealing with an information deficit. There's plenty of information out there and incredibly strong, diverse content that not only shows what the changes are, but what's causing them. I would wager that a big part of the reason why there's been inaction is a couple-fold. I think the first is one that we're starting to overcome, and that is that people always saw for a long time climate change as some distant issue, because it's a slowly manifesting thing, and by definition, right? But I think increasingly we're starting to see these impacts in our own backyard, and I mean that quite literally in the region here, but also across America, whether you're looking at wildfires in California or hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico or flooding of rivers in the Midwest. I mean, it's here. So it's not really that we don't see it as a far off problem anymore. I think there are kind of 2 other issues at play. I think one is, well, maybe 3, but one is that people struggle to see what they can do about it, right? I think it can be such, and the enormity of the challenge before us can often lead people to paralysis and inaction because it's such a collective action problem. And I think adding on to that is that, frankly, you have people that are deeply threatened by action to respond to climate change, right? And I'll just say anecdotally, you know, when I was a negotiator for the State Department, you know, the Saudi Arabians were unsurprisingly very reluctant to engage in ambitious climate action. And it was because their entire economy was driven by, you know, the sale of fossil fuels and fossil fuel derived products. And their argument was, look, you know, we get that the world is going to go in this direction, but our whole well-being, our whole society is founded on this product, right? And if, you know, the world makes a sudden change away from fossil fuels, we will have incredible instability and poverty and all sorts of things. And that's a real thing that we need to think about, and we see that manifesting itself at home in West Virginia and elsewhere when it comes to thinking about action. So I think the final piece I'll just say is that I think people see climate responses as a potential threat to their own well-being, and that near-term impact affects the longer-term benefit of taking climate action.
Yeah, so I'll continue from there. I think another reason at the individual level and even community level is that climate change involves or almost necessitates resilience from oneself and one's community to work in this space, which entails lots of uncertainty. We don't know if what we're going to do today, as Dave was saying, is going to make a difference moving forward. So why do anything now? Or people face climate grief, well, yeah, those are some of the implications. And so we can strengthen the training around this to help individuals and communities build their resilience so that they are more equipped to handle the complexity and tough emotions that arise with working in this field. And then another thing is just being honest about our values. Like, I think some people feel that they don't truly care, like what happens to future generations, like as long as their life goes well and they can live their life however they want. It's like, you know, who cares what's going to happen to the people 100 years from now, because I'm not going to be here. Whereas others care. And when you care, that's when you tend to want to make changes in your daily life. So having a real conversation about our values around this would be really important.
As a high school student, it's hard to know like what I personally can do. And over the summer, I've been learning that I do have a voice and many other young people have a voice that they can use. But I also think that a lot of pressure has been put on the younger generation, and we're not sure exactly what we need to do for it. And I think that there needs to be a connection between our generation that wants to make a change but doesn't know how, and the older generation with the resources and knowledge and technology to have a conversation about what we can do as a collective group, instead of older generation who left this problem and our generation who's just picking it up.
That's awesome, Sophie. I'm already thinking of this is the problem when I get in big groups, I think of new ideas for us to all, but I love the concept of mentoring each other. In fact, it goes both ways. And I know I can't speak for David, but I know he and I are just, you know, it helps us get up in the morning knowing and doing our day jobs, knowing that Pooja and Sophie and many, many others like you are fortifying our day jobs. And so I'm really grateful. The other thing I want to just try to think of what different to say from the other three. I meant to say earlier on, my background is fully in policy. I actually come from a social justice, housing, and public health background and moved into environmental conservation issues in the last 20 years. So one thing I did want to say before anything else is, don't think being an environmentalist comes in one shape and color or stripe. You can do anything. We have lawyers, finance directors, everyone works on our team that you might not think of as an environmentalist. So there's room for all of us. That's the most important thing. The other thing I just wanted to touch on is I try to remind myself that this is only historically a partisan issue. The debate, the lack, I wouldn't call it conversation, that goes on in the public sphere, on TV, etc., in the Senate, it's been somewhat intentional to create more divides between us, as opposed to, who said, thinking, Pooja, the values that we have in common. So President Bush, Republican governor from New York, there's many, many, many Republicans who have taken really important action. And I would say actually the divide has happened much more blatantly in the last 10 years. And for some of the reasons that were already discussed. But I think the real important piece of that is we really want to remember that 70% of people in the US understand that climate change is real. So engaging in long conversations about the science, as David said, doesn't really change anyone's mind, but when you connect with people on a personal level, ice fishing down the street from me or something that you have in common builds a bond and creates a way to act. And then the last thing I'll just add is in my mentor role, Sophie and Pooja, is in policy work, it's super important to be ready to go when the moment happens. So there's like years of work, right, leading up to it, and then the moment happens. You would not probably know from watching the news that when this last Congress in December finally signed a federal budget called the Omnibus Budget, that came with amazing steps forward from the last Congress on technology development to reduce capture of emissions, boosts of the rules on energy efficiency and modernization of the electrical grid. It did some work on HFCs, which are those things in your refrigerators, and there was some clean energy tax cuts. So you wouldn't have expected this last Congress to pass those, and they did. And it does help us it is incremental, but they are real steps. And then hopefully the next 2 years in particular, we'll be able to take some bigger strides.
That's fantastic. Thanks, you guys. These are great perspectives. I like having, it's a multi-generational perspective, which is really, really useful. So this one is near and dear to KCI's heart. So I'm anxious to hear everyone's response to this. How can grassroots action and a top-down policy approach work together to create real change? So David, you want to send us off?
Yeah, sure. So, one thing I think that's incredibly important on this point is climate literacy broadly. And this is where information matters, right? Because what this means then, and you've seen this, I'd say over the past, 4 or 5 years or so, in my experience, seeing the climate march firsthand, in DC was a real culmination of a lot of kind of, frankly, pent up anger about inaction, especially at the federal level, but not exclusively at the federal level. And I think what you saw both from what led to that was that society became more climate literate. And what I mean by that is that they understood the science better. They understood the impacts better. They understood how it is affecting their lives, and that there are things that we can't tangibly do. And so I think, seeing the impact, for example, that the Sunrise Movement has had on the national policy discourse, I think is a remarkable example of how grassroots efforts can really affect change. The Sunrise Movement, basically, a youth-driven movement, let's be clear, right? basically, you know, laid the foundation for the Green New Deal. And while the Green New Deal, you know, you can say whatever you want about it, it moved the needle on the policy discourse. You know, the Biden-Harris administration, you know, when they were campaigning, you know, it was the first time in the history of this country that climate change was among the top 4 priorities of an administration. You know, even when President Obama came in 2008, 2009, climate change ranked maybe, I don't know, around 16th of the top 20 priorities behind nuclear proliferation and things like that. It's now among the top 4 priorities. And you see that with everything that's happening today. And while the Green New Deal in and of itself may not be realized as in and of its entirety as policy, it has certainly influenced the policy discourse and driven a large faction of policymakers at the federal level into making it a priority. So I think that's a fantastic example.
To unmute. So building off of that, I think we as voters have to remember that we can hold our members of Congress and leaders accountable for their actions or lack thereof in the climate space. We can demand action on these issues, and if they're not, you know, doing these actions, we cannot vote for them, or, you know, vote for a candidate that more closely aligns with the world we envision. And then I think governments at all levels and the private sector need to create more spaces for conversation with folks at the grassroots levels and educate them about these avenues of communication. So that means having more town halls, adding youth seats to advisory boards and school boards, and more transparency on their sustainability efforts. That way, at the grassroots level, Indigenous voices, voices of BIPOC and youth, everyone have increased opportunities to communicate their concerns and needs.
So going off of David and Pooja's point, I think that it's important to make grassroots action opportunities available to more people, especially those who might not know much about the impacts of climate change and how it'll affect their lives. The youth movement is really powerful. We've seen over the past year, youth has this great tool in social media to speak what's on their mind and are able to connect to each other. The more grassroots organizations feel empowered by their members and supporters, the more communication we will see between them and those who will make policy decisions.
The other thing that's super important, I hear the question, it's a little different version of this question. Why should I take action? Why should our community take action? It's a global problem. What we know about behavioral science is that when we understand that our community supports something, we tend to want to be part of that community. So one thing we at the Conservancy have been really focused on in every state in the US and globally, but this is really relevant to the US, is kind of demonstrating what the future looks like. So investing with communities in northern Maine in particular on solar development on their community buildings. There's an immediate job benefit, there's immediate tax benefit as the community has to pay less for their municipal heat and light. And what we see from that is that you build long and quiet support. And why that's important is most days, it may change, you need 60 votes in the Senate to get any bill passed. As of yesterday, that may not be true, but so we need rural, more traditionally conservative voices to be also engaged, because having worked for a member of Congress, I can assure you that hearing from your constituents, as already been reflected, is really what, believe it or not, still moves people. A town manager calls up and say, we put solar on our community building. A member of the staff or the congressperson will respond immediately. That kind of action also matters. And so I think I want to just say is don't, Sophie, you used the word voice, don't underestimate yourself. Your voices, our voices do matter. And we saw it on the big scale, but I also want to emphasize at the community scale that also is really important. I know we're trying to speed up questions, so we'll try to be rapid fire here. Responses. Huh?
You are fine. I think that's a great exchange right there. In your opinion, so this kind of piggybacks on that last question in a lot of ways. So feel free to just say, I've already said this, but in your opinion, what is the best way to turn talk into action? And I think what I find exciting to hear all four of your opinions on this is that they come from different places. So I appreciate your opinions on this one.
Yeah, I just want to build off what Kate just said. You know, it really does matter to go in and talk to your elected officials, and that doesn't, while it does include, you know, the local offices of Senator Collins, Senator King, and Congresswoman Pingree and Golden. It's also, you know, in the State House. It's also in city halls and on town councils. You know, get smart and get educated. And I think if you're listening to this, it means that you already are, for the most part. You know enough to actually have a voice in this conversation, an educated voice at that. And it makes a difference, you know, because these are all constituent representatives, right? And so their job is to represent their constituent interests. And if they're not hearing what the concerns are, then they're not going to act on it. You know, we literally logged, you know, we got 12 calls on Social Security today in support of Social Security reform. We got 4 calls opposed to Social Security reform. You know, those things matter, you know, to call and to weigh in. And you know, the elected officials take notice. So I would, you know, I would certainly say that. The other thing I'll just say is don't limit it to elected officials. Just talking about it, it makes a difference. You know, be that crazy person in the grocery store that just like hits the person in the, you know, well, maybe not right now, but once we can get within 6 feet of people again, you know, hit them gently with the cart and be like, can you believe this rainfall? I think this might be some sort of climate impact. You know, mainstreaming this into conversations gets people thinking about it more, and it gets people thinking about how it's impacting their lives. And I think that's a really, really important thing.
So I'm just going to repeat the question. What, in your opinion, is the best way to turn talk into action? I think that, you know, while having these conversations, try and identify what frustrates you, what really annoys you about how the world currently is and how people are thinking about climate change, and then push yourself to envision like an ideal world. And I think, for example, during the inauguration, we heard Amanda recite her poem about, you know, what an America that she would want to live in looks like. So really pushing yourself to envision, what does a world, you know, where people care about climate change, what does that look like? And don't let the size and complexity of this issue deter you from taking a small step, because these small steps add up. It doesn't have to be some colossal, like, you know, I'm impacting 1 million people. It can just be, you know, I had a conversation with my mom, or, you know, with my classmate. And now together, now I know that we have these common interests, and together we can do something about it.
Like what Pooja said, that opening up small conversations and not having to go straight to electmen and higher up government, but starting small with people you know and school communities, and then eventually making your way up to talking to town managers and so forth. And I think that it is an everyday conversation. It's not just one Zoom meeting once a year about someone of this, but we need to really talk about it like every day, and like put our minds together and just think of something we can do together.
Well, you all said exactly what I was going to say. So because actually talk is action, and I think is the summary. But just building on the grocery store comment, I've given a version of a talk around talking about climate all over Maine. Some of the most fun is when I'm in island communities, and I'll be in a group, people who either live part-time or full-time on the island, and I say, let's just talk about what you've noticed in your lifetime. And it is amazing when you say that, as opposed to, I'm going to tell you all the reasons you need to believe me. I mean, I've heard great stories like, gosh, when I was younger, 4th of July parade, we all had wool sweaters on and long pants. And now we're wearing shorts and t-shirts, or we always had a fire going in our living room in the evenings on the island. And immediately you made it personal. You've gotten a connection with each other and say, yeah, gosh, I don't ever have to take a blanket to the beach, a warm blanket to Popham Beach. And it becomes something that you have in common. And then from there, you can build.
That's great. Okay, so what are your hopes for the future of carbon emissions, i.e. how do we slow it down or stop it?
How many hours do we have?
Yeah.
That's a really light question. It shouldn't take long.
Yeah, there's obviously the traditional ways of reducing and eliminating carbon emissions, whether it's through renewable energy or efficiency measures, which I think are exceedingly important. And I think efficiency broadly doesn't get enough coverage. But I think there's also, I think this misconception that there's a single solution out there. This is not a challenge that is going to have a silver bullet solution. And I think, as the senator I used to work for used to say, it's silver buckshot, and we need a little bit of everything. And I would just highlight, some of the emerging technologies and approaches that I think are super interesting. I think thinking about how we can maximize the kind of carbon sequestration ability of natural systems in the earth, whether it is on land or in the ocean. I think there's the potential for enormous possibility there. And, there are all sorts of unanswered research questions and ecosystem impacts and things like that. But I do think there are real opportunities there. If you ask an economist, they'll say the most efficient way to do this is to put a price on carbon. And I'm not an economist, and I'll be clear about that. And I think it's right that generally you want to tax behaviors that you want to see minimized. But at the same time, I would argue that there's no guarantee through a tax alone that you're going to have reductions realized, And so I think, we need to, I think you kind of need an all of the above type of response.
Yeah, and I'll take the kind of social approach to this question. I think the roles that race and equity play on carbon emissions and how we even go about solving these problems needs to be emphasized. So they should be at the forefront. For example, really questioning why certain plants or companies are building their, factories and other plants in specific areas and who it's impacting, and why don't we care more that it's impacting those people the way that it is. And so really pushing for everyone to put race and equity at the forefront of designing these solutions.
My hope would be to become less reliant on fossil fuels. As a society, we are a very consumption-based idea of thinking, that we don't stop to think about the things we use, buy, and eat and how they got to us. There are so many new and promising alternative energies, and just taking the time to educate yourself on these alternative products or alternative energy sources you can use. I think it's definitely something that I would like to learn more about. I don't think it's always on the forefront of people's minds because it sounds scary and daunting. And we should try to break it down so everyone can talk about it, as well as also new things being more expensive, where like new technologies, but in the long run, it can even out.
If I may just quickly, sorry, Kate, can I just add quickly to that? So on that point, aiding with the transition is very important. Like, let's say that we do switch to more solar energy and renewable energy. Up front, it will be an expensive transition. So we need to be able to help people who wouldn't be able to afford that transitional cost at the onset.
Yeah, actually it feeds into the next question that's in the chat, which is my colleagues in West Virginia have been doing really, I find, groundbreaking work to help in that transition between communities, and especially coal mining communities, and reclaiming the mines and turning them into solar fields. You know, there's real hardship for people who will say really rightfully, this country was built on our families' backs. And now you want to put us out of business. I mean, we've heard that tone, that tension in the election. And so I think your point, Pooja, is super important in, you know, where we've cited toxic waste, et cetera, and what communities are impacted. We need to proactively, essentially, make sure policies aren't business as usual, but take bigger steps to modify that. One other piece I wanted to build on in the last question is something you said, David, about our lands in our oceans, and that's near and dear to my heart, as you know. Just for a second, imagine Maine. So close your eyes, think of the state of Maine. An impressive 89% of this state is in forest land. We're the most forested state in the country. And I've got to look at my notes here. Those trees, the dead wood and the soils, hold about 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon today. That's as much carbon as could be saved by taking 47 million cars off the road for the next 25 years. And so at a kind of more human scale, the carbon in 100 acres of an average Maine forest equals about 6,500 vehicles driven for a year. So this is my plug, because I see some of my land trust friends out in the audience. And this was in the Climate Council plan, refunding the Land for Maine Future has multiple benefits, and one of them will be helping ensure that the state of Maine is continuing to absorb carbon.
That's great. We're having a couple of questions come in, and I want to make sure that we have time because we only have 10 minutes left. It goes quickly. I swear, I think we could have done this for 2 hours and would have had enough questions to fill the 2 hours. Please keep questions coming in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get them down. And if they don't get answered in the next 5 minutes or so, then we'll go ahead and send out a notice afterwards. So please put them in now if you want them to be answered by these 4 incredible minds. The first question that came to us really did piggyback, and Kate called attention to it, but it says, how do you engage with people that have started careers in traditionally carbon producing industries? For example, people who would stand to lose from the change. And I'm sure that you guys have lots of different opinions on that. And Kate, I know you addressed it a tiny bit, but I think if you guys have any opinions on that one or would like to voice your thoughts, that'd be great.
I'll yield my time since I spoke to it. So Pooja or anyone else wants to jump in.
Sure. So this is a really tough conversation to have, right? And you want to be sensitive to, I think first it comes to like learning all the sensitivities in this space and that those people have. And then showing how over time it is actually better to have this renewable energy. It will bring in more money, and that it's going to be a longer term, it's like an issue of longevity and having a cleaner lifestyle, and for their health. I think taking like a health angle is also important. Like working in the coal industry is very bad for one's health and one's community. So like maybe taking that angle would resonate more with the community.
Yeah, I think Pooja hit it right on the head. I think in a lot of ways, you got to be sensitive to the culture and that has existed in a given place for a long time. And I think, you know, diversifying economies is always a good thing. And I think, you know, we see it frankly, in coastal communities in Maine oftentimes, right? You don't want to necessarily rely on a single species, or if you're a fishing community and things like that. And the same can be said as to whether you're a coal mining town in West Virginia. You know, but I think it also, I think there's two other related points. One is that these things don't happen overnight. And I think we need to be clear about that, both to the people whose jobs are currently encumbered in those industries, but also to the broader public, that we're not going to be able to get off this stuff overnight. And I think it's imperative that we sort of, you know, sort of make that transition as just as possible and as sensitively as possible, and create those kind of those opportunities for growth. From a policy perspective, you know, I'm always struck when the fossil fuel industry says, well, you know, you're picking winners and losers by giving these tax credits to wind and solar companies. But the oil and gas and coal companies have been getting tax credits for over a century, right? and at an enormous expense to American society, not even counting all the externalities that aren't accounted for. So my point is that historically we've provided government subsidies basically to extract that product from the ground. And I think a case can be made to invert that structure, take those incentives and keep it in the ground. And I think you see obviously a lot of NGOs working towards that now.
I said I'd yield my time, but you know, I can't help myself. I just want to just say I've seen so many wonderful people out here in this WebEx, and you know, the other thing I think that we the environmental movement has done ourselves a disservice around is not trusting in the wisdom of a community of stakeholders. And I think that kind of getting to that question that's in the chat, we see real success here in Maine of groups like David and mine working directly with fishermen to understand what they're seeing out in the ocean, and having that knowledge influence policy change. We can together produce all the science to support what they're saying and see, but that lived experience we're keeping with this theme. And I think we as a community have to understand that expertise comes in a lot of different ways.
That's great. We do have one more question. We literally have like 2 or 3 minutes before I want to close it out. I'm going to go with this second question. Sophie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nope.
All right. I just didn't want to cut you off. What are some of the major steps the new administration and Congress can take to help Maine quickly build a zero emissions and regenerative economy? That's probably a long question. If you have some quick bullet points you want to add, and then I think we should take that question a little bit longer and send out a more thoughtful answer at the end after this. So let me know if you guys have anything you want to quickly add to that question.
I'll just quickly say, Ezra, that one of the things we really focused on in the Climate Council is, again, this reality that transportation, that we all contribute to has a huge impact. And how do we as a rural state transition to electrification and investment in our more densely populated communities on public transportation. And the reason acting on transportation and the transition from gas fired engines is that we in Maine hold on to our cars a really long time. And so every year we delay as a society, essentially, we're just adding years of fossil fuel burning in our vehicles. So for me, I'm feeling, and our team is feeling, real urgency in trying to work with the Mills administration and eastern states to figure out a system together that would begin to reduce transportation emissions.
If I can just add one point to that, because I think Kate's dead on, transportation is such an important source of emissions in the state. And I think you can look at it, right, there's a couple ways to look at it. One is like, what are the actual vehicles that we're driving? And then there's the infrastructure around that and providing the incentives and the subsidies to kind of build out that infrastructure. But I think the other is kind of, reducing the need to travel in the first place, potentially, right? So reducing vehicle miles traveled. And a key way to do that is to not only provide broadband access, across the state, but to make sure that it's not only reliable, but affordable and accessible. And I think it's that second and last piece that oftentimes gets left out of the conversation.
That's fantastic. Anybody else want to mention anything? All right, you guys. Well, I forced you to finish up quickly and now we're finished. But if you guys have any of our panelists or any of our guests, if you guys have anything you want to add into the chat, please take this time to do it. If it's just a question you have on your mind, we'd love to have that and send it out to our panelists and then be able to send you the responses along with the recording of this. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. I think it's important. This conversation to me is what needs to happen more often, having people from different sectors of business, but also including the youth voices, both high school and postgraduate, I think is really valuable. And hopefully you guys see how engaged and ready to act these guys are. So I'm going to end with one last question. I told you guys I was going to do this. The last question I have for you is, what is one piece of advice you would give to a young person who wants to be involved and doesn't know how? Before they answer, I'm going to encourage all of our guests to join any of these initiatives that you see posted here. Please come and check us out at Kennebunkport Climate Initiative. Check out the GMRI, check out TNC, and Pooja's new Youth Climate Collaborative that she's working on. We really would love for you guys to support us. And what is the answer to the question of the day? What is one piece of advice you would give to a young person who wants to get involved and doesn't know how? Dave, kick us off.
This may be a somewhat unorthodox response, but it's something that I think frankly inhibited me growing up, and that's ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I used to sit in classrooms and have questions and not ask them because I didn't want to be embarrassed, and people in power always think, can be intimidating, whether it's a teacher or a congressperson or, a CEO or whatever, or even a parent, and I think it's okay to ask questions because it shows that you're engaged and it shows that you value what that person has to say. And it only results in you having more knowledge to carry forward into future conversations.
Yeah, and I would add to that, you can even ask these folks who you may see as mentors, like, do you know of any opportunities to get involved, or how have you gotten involved in the past? And then for my answer, I would say doing a simple, even like Google search, right? Like to find which organizations are near you that are working on climate change or these topics, and then reading about what they're doing and seeing if, you can get involved with them.
From the student perspective, I would definitely see if you have any environmental clubs at your middle school or high school. I know we have one, as well as the Gulf of Maine Field Studies class. If you're able to take that either through Kennebunk High School or UNE, to definitely give that a try, because I have learned a lot through that.
Okay, I'm going to do one piece of advice with 3 bullets. So I'm adopting, I have to figure out how to do it, but Sophie's idea about mentorship, but keeping it bi-directional. This one we brought up, but cannot overemphasize enough that selectmen's meetings, I mean, planning board meetings, those, a lot of education, you know, your school board meeting, a lot of decisions get made about your immediate life in those meetings, and we need a lot more people engaged in that local decision making. And the last thing on the theme of we need everyone, I mean, someone said it, we need all options, right? We can't choose a forest in Maine over a forest in Brazil. We need both. And so we need everyone. And so again, whether you're interested in finance, we need people to be innovative finance people. We need, you know, we need a lot more lawyers to help us, right, Chip? You're out there. I see some lawyers in the group. And, you know, so I guess I'm just going to leave with that theme, like, you don't have to be an environmentalist, not that it's a bad word, but that we need everyone. And so my piece of advice is keep talking to each other and just show up.
I think those are all great pieces of advice. So thank you guys all for coming, talk, educate yourself, and get involved. And all of our organizations can use your voices and your help. So thank you so much for joining us. We have another webinar. We have another webinar in March, so keep your eyes open for that.
Thanks, KCI, for organizing.
Oh, thank you. Thank all of our panelists.
Thanks, everyone.